Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. My name first is Fanar Haddad. I'm a senior research fellow here, and it's my pleasure to welcome Uyur. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah. Uyur Umit Ungor. He is an associate professor at the Department of History at Utrecht University, and he's a research fellow at the Institute of War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam. His main areas of interest are state formation and nation formation, with a particular focus on mass violence. His most recent publications include an edited volume entitled Genocide: New Perspectives on Its Causes, and Consequences, and that came out in 2016. Prior to that, he was the author of Confiscation and Destruction: The Young Turk Seizure of Armenian Property. That came out in 2011. And also in 2011, he published the award-winning The Making of Modern Turkey, Nation and State in Eastern Anatolia, 1913 to 1950. That came out with Oxford University Press also in 2011. And he's currently leading a large-scale research project on paramilitarism, and he's also writing a global history of the phenomenon. And today he'll be talking about an ongoing research project, the Syrian Oral History Project, Relevance, Approach, and Examples. And that briefly looks at how people experience mass violence, and specifically it aims to document and research Syrians' experiences of mass violence and the dynamics of the violent conflict in Syria. But he is far more qualified to tell you about it than I am, so I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, Fanar, for your kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be in Singapore. I'm actually traveling through because I'm visiting my sister. And this is the fourth day here. I think I am about to get over my jet lag. I've never flown 12 hours, so that was quite a bit of a challenge. But not as much as a challenge, of course, as the research that I'm doing right now, which I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about now. So we started a project in the Netherlands called the Syrian Oral History Project. In this project, we aim to interview as many Syrians as possible in a relatively systematic way, in a scholarly way, and in a way that helps us understand modern Syrian history better. And we already launched the project. We've interviewed about, let's say, 80 to about 100 Syrians, but there are about 80,000 Syrians in Holland, and we'd like to expand this ideally to a number, let's say 10% of that population. So we want to interview about 8,000 to 10,000 Syrians. Now, today what I'll do is I'll explain a couple of things for you. First and foremost, I'll give you a bit of context. So what is it that needs to be understood about the Syrian crisis? A little bit of background knowledge for those of you who might not be fully updated about this current very tragic conflict. And then two important topics. One is the relevance of the project. So why is it important to interview all these people? What's the point? And secondly, the approach. So how will we do this? So how will we go about its methodology? I'll talk a little bit about interview techniques and some of the obstacles and challenges, and also advantages of interviewing oral history research into Syrian communities in Europe, but also the Middle East in general. And I'll give you a few examples. So it brings alive a little bit the project, and I'll give you examples of 3 Syrians that I've interviewed personally about their life experiences and what that says about the conflict. So let me first give you a little bit of context. Here's a little bit of a timeline of the Syrian conflict. As you well know, in the beginning of 2011, the conflict, quote unquote, began with a series of challenges to the Assad regime. There was a major uprising in Daraa, especially in March 2011. In the summer, that escalated as there was regime violence towards demonstrators first, and then counter-violence in the summer of 2011 by the Free Syrian Army. These were mostly defectors from the army. And by the winter of 2011-12, it had become a full-scale armed conflict. And I think it's important to point out here that this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides, that we cannot characterize the Syrian conflict as one particular thing. We cannot reduce it to it was a revolution only, or it was a civil war only, or it is a massacre only. It is many different things. There are many layers of processes and sub-processes, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But you see that very well in this timeline. Until 2011, 2012, it was something else than what it became after that. Namely, it became a fully fledged civil war. Many Syrians were bearing arms against each other. You had factionalization, you had gradual radicalization of the violence, which for which one of the best symbols was when the Free Syrian Army in 2012, in the month of Ramadan, they entered Aleppo, which is the largest city and the economic powerhouse of Syria, and a major challenge to the Assad regime. Had Aleppo fallen fully to the rebels, then we would have seen a completely different picture right now. In 2013, a new player came to the forefront, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, now called ISIS, or the Islamic State. It entered Syria, brought a completely different dynamic, and since 2014, we've seen more or less military deadlock until, let's say, middle of last year. And since October 2015, there's been Russian involvement, and since August 2016, Turkish involvement. So we have also high levels of foreign involvement, both in the region as well as in global powers. In November 2017, ISIS was defeated, in quotation marks. And right now, as we have seen, just in the past couple of weeks, the Turkish army has entered the Kurdish enclaves of Afrin in the north. So the conflict's ongoing. It's a complex conflict that has transformed in different ways. What we have seen in, let's say, 2015 is a picture as the following. So I hope this is a bit visible. We have here 4 colors. Yellow are the Kurds, green are the rebels, red is the regime, the Assad regime, the Syrian government, and black, was here, looks a little bit gray, is ISIS. So this was the situation in 2015. The current picture that we're looking at is more like this. So you've seen the black has disappeared, the red, the Assad regime has taken over until the river, to the Euphrates, and then yellow, the Kurdish area, has also expanded significantly. The rebels, on the other hand, the green color, has lost significant territory in the north, but especially in the south, and in the center of the country, there are only a few pockets left. So this just to give you an image of what are we looking at. Now, the important point I want to make here is 2 points I want to make about these type of maps. On the one hand, they explain military control. Yes, it is true that in the red areas, the Assad regime is in control, and in the yellow areas, the Kurdish forces, the YPG, PYD, are in control. But the maps, they also conceal, in a way, for example, how ordinary people live on the ground. So if you want to understand how people live in the red areas, the only way to understand that is by approaching them and interviewing them, rather than assuming that these areas are pro-regime. Second point I want to make is that the map, the kind of military control map, it doesn't say that much really about kind of the history of Syria. So we have, for example, the yellow areas over here. They are now under the control of the Kurdish areas. Immediately, Kurdish nationalists, for example, have posed that this is part of historic Kurdistan. However, if you would look on the ground, especially here in the south, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, Hasakeh, these towns are majority Arab towns. And so we are dealing with a situation in which the rulers are of a different ethnic or sectarian background than the people on the ground, right? So the maps, they show something, but they also conceal something. What I mentioned before about processes and sub-processes, I want to get back to that for a minute. And I want to show that with the following Venn diagram. So very often I've interviewed Syrians and I have to be very careful interviewing them because the language you use betrays something about the way you see the world. So if I interview a Syrian and I tell him or her, what was your experience in the civil war? One guy, for example, said, it's not a civil war, it's a revolution. So, okay, I think I know where you are standing. So I have to make sure that I approach my language differently. He thinks this is a mass popular revolution against the Assad regime. That's the only thing that is important to him. Every other process he disregards. So I had to point out, well, what about the fighting then? Yes, there is fighting, but this is a revolution. So I tried to explain to the Syrians, because the next person I would interview, I would ask him, what about your life during the revolution? And she would say, it's not a revolution, it's a terrorism, or it's a civil war. She would have denial of revolution or denial of civil war. Whereas I try to argue that actually all of these processes are happening at the same time, but maybe with different magnitude. So the whole thing, the most neutral word I can come up with that all Syrians agree on is conflict. Right? There's a conflict. Some people can't get along, and therefore we have a conflict, military conflict, but also a civil conflict. Within that conflict, we have an uprising. This is the large kind of circle here. And partly overlapping with that uprising, we have a violent conflict or a civil war. So both those things exist. They also overlap to some extent, because the overlap here are those revolutionaries who in the beginning of the uprising were peaceful, they went into the streets, but they took up arms because they radicalized. And they went, so from this circle to this circle. Inside that violent conflict, civil war, we have also a process of violence against civilians, or in the form of massacres or genocide. So it is a complex conflict. There are different processes. There's a kind of main process, the conflict, and there are sub-processes. All of them are important to look at, and all of them are important to probe into. But it is important to ask somebody, why do you think it is not a revolution? Why do you believe this is only a popular uprising? And why do you deny, for example, the fact that there is violence between Syrians? Right? And so in these questions we will ask, and it's part of the context of the conflict. It defines a bit how we approach people. Because you have to be careful. If you use the wrong term, then somebody doesn't want to be interviewed anymore, and your research project is over. Okay, let me move on now to the relevance. Why is it important to conduct a project such as this one? I was talking before a little bit with Fanat, and he asked me, are you writing a book about this topic? And I said, no, this is not just my book or my project. What we try to do is to create a body of knowledge, let's say hundreds, thousands of hours of videotaped interviews with people everybody can use. So all of you, whatever you're interested in, you can come to the Institute in Amsterdam. You can put in the search terms. You'll get, let's say, 50 or 60 interviews that are relevant to your topic, whether it's women's issues or child soldiers, or it's about economic issues, or it's about smuggling or organized crime, or you're only interested in Damascus, or you're only interested in Aleppo, or you're only interested in the year 2014. You can put that into the search codes and that would appear, and you can make it researchable. No, the relevance is actually in at least three important themes. First of all, there's a scholarly relevance. Syria, but also Iraq, I agree with that with Fanar. Syria is one of the worst researched societies in the world, really. There's a famous Syrian expert who said that you can write one book about Syria and that will be your last book about Syria, because you will not get any access to the country, for example, or you'll have difficulties approaching people. And so it has a scholarly relevance because we need to fill gaps in the scholarship. There are so many things that we don't know yet about this country, this society. And for most people in the media, of course, they just read about the news 2011. Syrians started killing each other, and then they started Googling, where is Syria? Because they wouldn't even know where the country is. But the country has a rich and very particular history. There are particular different regimes, and we need to understand that history as well as the ongoing conflict. And because we don't understand it, we can't make sense of the conflict. We can't make sense of the conflict, we cannot resolve the conflict. One of the best examples is the great massacre in the city of Hama in 1982. So from 1976 to 1982, there was a conflict between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Syrian government. So this was first a civil strife, then it turned into a bit of a guerrilla war, civil war, and it culminated in the siege and the bombardment of the city of Hama in 1982. Up to today, we don't have a single book that details the massacre of Hama. There's one book that talks a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood in the aftermath of the massacre, but we don't have a well-researched book about this particular massacre, even though, according to estimates, maybe 15,000 to maybe up to 40,000 people died. We don't even know that. So that's a very good example, I think. Whereas many other cases, such as the conflict in Yugoslavia or the civil war and genocide in Cambodia, are very well researched. But this particular period isn't. So there's a scholarly relevance for pure academic reasons. The second important reason is the societal relevance. It is important for Syrians, and half of the country now lives, half of the working population now lives outside the country. There are 3 million Syrians in Turkey. There are at least 1 million in Lebanon. There are 1 million in Germany. Millions of Syrians living outside their country. And for example, those in Europe, they will at some point need to integrate into German society or European societies. How can people trust state institutions, for example? How can they trust the police? If we don't understand them, if we don't understand how Syrians perceive the police, right? So I once invited a Syrian, I'll give you an example. I once invited a Syrian guy who was arrested by the secret police in Syria twice, and he was tortured twice. I put him on the front row and I told him, okay, watch this. And I had a class full of 80 Dutch students. And I'm not sure what you know about Dutch people. They're very sweet. They have no experiences with violence in the past 70 years. 3 generations, very peaceful. And these young Dutch kids, I told the story about one guy who was arrested and he was tortured twice. That was him. Didn't give his name. And then one of the girls in the back room, in the back of the room, she raised her hand. And I said, yeah, what is it? And she wanted to ask a question. I said, go ahead. And she said, well, the guy was arrested. Why didn't he just go to the police? And I thought, well, clearly you haven't understood anything of Syrian society because you were arrested by the secret police. If you go to the regular police, you will end up in the same cell that you just came from. And then the guy started laughing. He said, this is absurd to us. So it is important, I think, for the integration, for citizenship, as they would call it in the US, for Syrians to be heard, to be listened to. The second important problem in the societal relevance is the psychological treatment. The rough estimate is that half of all Syrians are moderately to heavily traumatized as a result of the conflict. They have existential fears. A lot of them have post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of these people are my friends, so I know what I'm talking about out of personal experience. You would be sitting in a room, a door would smash, and they would totally flinch, even though I'd say it's just a door. But that's not what they're hearing. They're hearing a bomb fall, right? So how can this person be a useful member of society if we don't treat them psychologically? The other problem here is that also psychological treatment, or the discipline of psychology, clinical psychology, for me is a very legitimate endeavor, of course. But for most Syrians, in Syrian culture, it means that you are crazy. So I suggested once to a friend of mine who said, I can't sleep all night. I said, why not? Because I'm hearing the bombs fall. Then I asked him, have you ever considered talking to a psychologist? And he said, sure, ana majnoon? What, am I crazy? I said, I'm not suggesting you're crazy. I'm just saying that a human brain is a human organ like any other organ. If you have a problem with your heart, you go to a cardiologist. You have a problem with your brain, you go to a psychologist. And so there are major cultural barriers. So this is also a matter of education for the Syrians themselves. Then third, there's an important legal relevance. According to estimates, there are at least hundreds of 400 to 500, according to the German authorities, Syrian war criminals in Germany. So out of 1 million, I think that's a very small number actually. Most of them are of course still back in Syria fighting. It is important also, we need the Syrian community to track down these war criminals. It is the Syrians who know exactly what happened in what neighborhood in which street, on which day, to whom. And it's only through them and their testimony that we can arrest the war criminals and we can bring them to justice, even under the German legal system. There's a concept called universal jurisdiction, which means that you have committed a war crime anywhere in the world, you can be tried according to the German law or the Dutch law or the Swedish law, for example. One man was tried in Sweden. There are now 2 cases going on in Germany. I've spoken a few weeks ago with the head prosecutor for international crimes in the Netherlands, and he said that they have 3 cases coming in 2018 of men who have been fingered as having committed war crimes in Syria, and they will be arrested and they will be tried. And who are the people who pointed out these war crimes? They were the Syrians themselves. So we need this interview project for all these 3 reasons. Now, if we look at what it means for the Syrians themselves, I want to give you 2 examples of the academic relevance. One is about how Syrians talk about each other. In a civil war, we see heavy polarization. There are at least 4 different groups: the Kurds, the rebels, Assad, and ISIS. And the way that they talk about each other is in heavily polarized terms. Here are some of these words that they use. And I give you the English translation here with the original Arabic. And as I interviewed Syrians, these are the words that I would hear the most. So the best thing that a Syrian would call another Syrian from another group is a criminal, mujrim. But most often they would be hashara, or they would be haywanat, or worse, they would be khanazir, who are najis. So they wouldn't say they are human beings, they have a different political opinion than me, let's agree to disagree. That's not the situation. The country is so deeply polarized that this is the way people talk to each other. So we have a concept for this in the social sciences. It's called dehumanization. Syrians dehumanize each other on a massive scale. And it's important for us to understand the dynamics of dehumanization. We kind of understand how it escalates to that level. How can we get it back to rehumanize people? How can they start seeing each other as human beings again, who might have different political opinions, but at least they are not khanazir, haywanat, etc. The second issue is about which is closely connected to the previous one, is the moral and social expulsion from society. So imagine that you're living in, take any one part of Syria. So that it's divided into 4 parts. Let's take for example, the regime, the Assad regime. Inside that regime, those people who are treated with those words that I just mentioned, they are expelled from society. So you get a process. Oh, I had a nice little slide here in which this little circle would go there. Okay, I just pointed out now then. So they're expelled from society. They're no longer seen as fully worthy members of society. The challenge is sociologically to try to bring them into society, and how do we do that? And we can only do that if we listen to them. Here's a good example of the dynamic with that polarization. We have come to you with slaughter, Nusayris. The Nusayris is a different word for the Alawites. It's a small religious group, many of whom support the Assad regime, many of whom also don't. This is a graffiti by the Islamic State, which they would paint on different walls of cities that they conquered. So they would paint Janaikum bad-dabah, ya Nusayriya. So we've come to you with slaughters. Very, very clear genocidal threats. All Nusayris are seen as potential objects of violence. And it is only by talking to Syrians we can understand the discourse of violence, the polarization in the society. I'm also personally very interested, as somebody who studies conflict and violence, in the forms of violence. And Syrians have been, unfortunately, subjected to many different forms of violence. And some of these are maybe very common or imaginable to you, many others maybe aren't. So there's been indiscriminate violence, for example. If we categorize the violence, there's indiscriminate violence and then there's specific targeted violence. The indiscriminate violence is shelling, barrel bombing, chemical attacks, sniping, especially in 2011-12, but also 2013 in Aleppo. You would have a neighborhood. In the corners of the neighborhood, there would be high buildings. Snipers would be up on those buildings, taking aim and just sniping anything that walks through the neighborhood, anything and everything. So it gives the fear of the kind of agoraphobia. I noticed that with one of my Syrian friends. He doesn't want to go into the streets. He doesn't want to cross the street. And I'm standing on the other side. We're in Amsterdam, man. Don't worry. The worst thing that can happen is a bicycle hits you, right? And he wouldn't. And this is because he's been living in a neighborhood for 3 years. They were under permanent threat of snipers. There's also targeted violence. There are specific massacres against specific ethnic or religious groups, against specific neighborhoods. There are executions of particular individuals who are picked out. One fighting group would enter one neighborhood. They would have a list. These are the people we want. They would go to their houses, pick them out, execute them in the streets. Sometimes and put it on YouTube. Hunger is also often used. Siege. Time-tested methods, of course, dating back to antiquity. Then there's targeted violence against lawyers, because they uphold the rule of law, against doctors, because they help the wounded of the enemy combatants, reporters, journalists. Syria was and is the most dangerous country in the world for journalists, more than any other country. There's specific violence against children, against conscientious objectors, people who don't want to be signed up in any of the fighting groups, either the regime or the whatever. If you're a young man, in your 20s, for example, a rebel group takes over your neighborhood, or a regime takes over your neighborhood, or ISIS takes over your neighborhood and says, you're a young man, you're going to come to the army with us now. Here's a uniform, here's an AK-47, go fight with us. If you say, I'm not interested, the chances are high that you're gang pressed into fighting, or in some cases you also have executions of these men. Then torture is a major form of violence. I would say even Syria is a land of torture. They are, the levels of torture in Syria have always been very high, even predating the current conflict, predating the Assad regime. It goes back even from before the French mandate. And you can imagine any and all forms of violence against human bodies under detainment. So in prisons in Syria, it doesn't matter who runs the prisons, there are systematic forms of violence against people in the form of torture. Then there are forced disappearances, there's ethnic cleansing, or the demographic engineering, as one would call. And my point that I want to make here is that all these different forms of violence, you would say they all damage people and communities. They do. But they produce different types of traumas. For example, torture. We know a lot of people in Holland. Some of my very close friends are survivors of torture. It produces a different trauma in them than, for example, somebody who had their brother or their father forcibly disappeared. One day, 3 men in the middle of the night came to the door, took their father away, never returned. So these people have a really hard time because there's no grave. You don't know if he's dead or if he's alive. You cannot mourn him because you don't know if he's dead. And so there's a kind of you're permanently in a kind of waiting condition. It's a different trauma from if you were tortured, from if you were a survivor of any of these other forms of violence. So this is what basically the country has had to deal with. So this is the relevance. It seems to me rather kind of self-evident what the relevance is of interviewing Syrians. You can also now imagine, and I can read this from your facial expressions, how difficult this is going to be to interview people about these experiences. And we have, in order to make this a little bit more manageable, we categorized 4 major research categories or questions. And we did this based on the periods that were relevant on the Syrian history. So there's one category that we want to look at from 1970 to 2000, life under Hafiz Assad, the father of the current president. And we're interested, for example, in social economic life, in political life, in sectarianism, for example. We were talking about that. How did Syrians experience sectarianism, religious and ethno-religious differences in the country? So a Syrian boy or a Syrian girl who was born, let's say, in a Shiite or an Ismaili or Christian family, as this child grows up, what does the child learn about the world, about being a minority, for example, or being a minority in power, or being, for example, outnumbered? How do they imagine their individual position, and how do they mirror themselves in the society, in their collective identity? These are only some of the questions that are relevant. The second issue is, of course, the life under Bashar al-Assad. This is the son. There are some major everyday life changes. There's some liberalization of the economy. Syrians set up businesses, but there was also significant corruption and cronyism. How did Syrians experience this? And I'll give you one example. So one of the persons I know, who I've interviewed, is a man of my age. I wanted to say young man, but I'm not young anymore, so I can't say that. Is a man who is now in his late 30s, who was a banker in Syria. He just wanted to have a good life. So he studied economics, then he went to a bank, he made some money, and one day he was arrested because he said something against the president. He disappeared in a cell for 2 months. Then when he was released, the bank fired him. And he could never get his job back, so he ran off. And now he's living in Holland. He's a devastated man. Can't get a job, doesn't want to study, sits all night until 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, drinking himself under the table, while his wife and his baby are downstairs, and he doesn't engage with them. So he's a friend. I care about him dearly. And one thing that happened, I asked him about this period. Of course, we talked a lot about the third question, about what happened in the uprising. But I also asked him about the second period. Can you tell me a little bit about life working for this bank? Sure, he said. For example, I got a job. I was the HR manager of the bank. It's a relatively big bank in Damascus. And then we were going to hire somebody. We needed like a deputy HR director. So we put out an ad, we emailed, circulated, and then we selected 3 CVs. 3 of the applicants were good. I interviewed them and I chose one. One was the best CV, best experience. Just when I wanted to appoint this person, I got a phone call from the director of the bank, who told me in about 1 hour, there's a woman who's going to walk into your office, and you're going to appoint her as deputy HR director. And I said, but sir, we already have 3 people lined up, because it took us 1 month to appoint somebody. We went through an application procedure. He said, look, I don't care. This is important. You're going to appoint somebody because she's the niece of the cousin of the nephew of the neighbor of the whatever of the president, right? This is very important, because if we don't appoint her, we will have trouble. So the other 3 people basically didn't get the job, of course, and this person was appointed. Totally unqualified. Couldn't send an email. He had to send the emails for the deputy director. Doesn't know what email is, right? So we send an email. She would go to the address bar of the web browser and type it in there, thinking that the email would send. So this is the kind of corruption, the stories that you will get about lack of meritocracy in this period. Also important, I think. A third set of questions that we want to ask is about the uprising and the conflict. So how did Syrians mobilize? Why did they go into the streets and demonstrate? This is one of the first questions I asked. Why did they go into the street and counter-demonstrate? Why did they, and how did they radicalize? I'm interested also in the stories of imprisonment. There's mass imprisonment. There's about 250,000 people imprisoned in Syria, most of them political prisoners. And of course, fighting. Why did people fight? Of course, it's relatively difficult to find people who have been fighting. So there are a lot of defectors from either one of the armies. I'm also interested in, why did you pick up a weapon? I think the weapon was the best way to go forward. So you understand the motives of why people want to fight. And then, of course, the fourth category of questions is flight, asylum, and life abroad. So how did Syrians frame the conflict? I always ask them, what do you think are the causes of this conflict? And you get a range of completely different answers. And it's very important, I think, to look at how Syrians frame the conflict. How do they imagine what we say, bless you, TJ, transitional justice? What is the way forward? How can we bring justice and move on, have reconciliation in Syria? Totally different answers. How do they want to integrate? Do they want to integrate in new societies in Europe? Do they want to stay or do they want to go back? What are the responses of the Syrian children? The same guy that I just mentioned who was working for a bank has a daughter, small daughter, and the daughter would come up to her father one day, he told me. My daughter came up to me and she asked me, "Daddy, what is Syria?" So the kid doesn't, of course, she hears the term all the time, she doesn't know what it is. And the father said, I don't know what I'm going to answer her. Am I going to talk about all the bloodshed and the destruction? Is that what she wants to learn at that age? So it's also important in the children's generation. Okay, one of the things I want to do is now move on to approaches, talk a little bit about approaches, and then we can have a Q&A session. I try to combine approaches in this research. So there's a kind of top-down approach. I want to look at documents that the perpetrators produce. All of the rebel groups and all of the regime groups, even, of course, ISIS, all of these fighting factions, they produce material. They document their fighting. They put stuff on social media. It's important to look at all this stuff and then offset it with experiences. For example, one of the fighting groups is an Islamic fighting group called Ahrar al-Sham. They're mostly active in the north of Syria, center and north of Syria. They announced in August 2013 a major campaign in one of the valleys in Syria. And they said, we're going to overtake these 15 villages and we're going to establish justice there. When they announced it, they had a set of goals. So what you can do is you can download these goals. You can go to people who are from those villages and interview them about how did you experience this? Did they indeed bring justice, or did they indeed redistribute land, what they promised they would do? Or are we dealing with a completely different ballgame here? So once you combine them, you can draw the line, let's say, from inside out or from outside in. Now, myself, I've done a couple of interviews, and I started my interviews actually in the area. And I'll tell you a little bit about that research before I go on to some examples. I did interviews in two areas. One is this called Antakya, and the second one is Gaziantep. This is a map of the north of Syria. This is the Turkish-Syrian border. Right, so, and as you can see, this was in 2015 when ISIS was still in control here, the black area. And for a particular reason, I made this city, Gaziantep, green, because a lot of Syrian opposition people are there. So the green opposition people, they would be mostly there. Also for a specific reason, I made Antakya red, because a lot of pro-Assad people from the kind of the Assad areas are active there, or they're stationed there. So in the interviews that I did, it would be, I think, too much of a task to summarize all my interviews, but there are a couple of issues that were relevant, and that will be also relevant in this particular oral history project. There are at least the following. Who should and can be interviewed? Are we going to interview only, let's say, important people, or are we interested in also social history, the man in the street, the woman in the street? There are possibilities and there are impossibilities. I think in some people are impossible to be interviewed. So, for example, if you're interested in interviewing one of the regional commanders of ISIS, you can forget about that. Of course, they don't want to be interviewed. Even now, they don't want to be interviewed. They're never going to be able to be interviewed. Not in any transparent way. The most important thing for me was trust. If you don't build up trust, you cannot interview people. So I spent a lot of time eating a lot of Syrian food with people and drinking a lot of Syrian coffee with people until the coffee came out of my eyes. But this was important. I've interviewed friends, acquaintances, neighbors, and family of particular people I wanted to interview. I've interviewed people who are pro-Assad, anti-Assad, grey people, Jamaat Ramadi, they call them, so the grey community. Those are people who are neither this nor that. So we don't want anything with this conflict, we're just going to retreat. We just want our families to be safe. Get me out of this conflict. Many of the refugees are what they call grey people, who are resented by the pro-Assad and by the anti-Assad people, by the way. I've interviewed atheists, Islamists, each with their jargon and their culture, activists, people who are involved in media, for example, journalists. And it was quite a challenge, actually, to to actually build trust with each of these different type of groups. But I had a couple of principles when you interview. First of all, do no harm. Second, you have to use informed consent. You have to tell people why you're interviewing them. And I always use the scholarly relevance argument. But it's important for us to write the history of Syria, right? All of them would agree with that. Confidentiality also very important. Some people wanted their full name and face and last name and email address out in the open. It would be completely transparent. The whole world should know my story, they said. And others said, just initials, please. No, you know what? No initials even. Just say 26-year-old man from Aleppo. I respected that. And I will respect that in my book, and we have to respect that in the project. Because, finally, data production also means data protection. If people give you intimate details about what happened to them, you have a responsibility to protect the privacy of the individual, even if those experiences are important for a broader audience and for the scholarly community. Now, one of the questions that I talked about with my colleagues is it ethical to secretly tape war criminals? I'm going to leave that question for you to think about a little bit and move on to 3 examples before I end. The first example I want to give is not the man on the left, that's me, of course, is this young man from eastern Aleppo. And his name is Ayman. I promised I wouldn't use his last name only as initial. And this is a young man who was 21 years old in 2011. So he's younger than me. And he was from the Department of Literature, of the Department of English Literature at University of Aleppo. So he stayed in Syria from 2011 to 2013. Then he moved to Gaziantep. And he would go back and forth to Aleppo, and I interviewed him in Gaziantep twice. And his story is very interesting. This was one of the young guys who went into the streets and demonstrated against Assad. Then he was arrested. He was arrested, interestingly, by his own fellow students. There were a group of students in the university that were pro-Assad. They would get a lot of points, let's say, if they would inform on their fellow students and even arrest them with citizens arrest and bring them in. So that happened to him. He was in prison once. The conditions in prison I've already explained. He got out. And then he got out, he went back to his family. And his family said, "You are bringing great trouble upon this family. We are a prominent family in Aleppo. We are a business family. And we are getting in trouble because of you. The regime is now sending its agents to us to check up on you. They're asking your uncle and your father, where are you? You know, is Ayman still doing his revolution business? Tell him to not take up opposition against us." So because of that pressure on his family, he fled to Turkey. But he would go back and forth to Aleppo. At some point in 2012, late 2012, 2013, he goes back to Aleppo. And then he sees the neighborhood actually completely changed. He says, instead of like civil activists, all of a sudden there were men who were fighting. There were more, I saw more Kalashnikovs than I saw smartphones and digital cameras, he said. Well, wait a minute, this is not the revolution that I signed up with. So there was a sense of disillusionment. But he also, what can you do with a smartphone against a machine gun? Not much. So he went back to Gaziantep. He stayed there, continued his activism for an NGO, mostly in relief. Then he came back to Syria. And this was 2014. And that was a mistake. He came back to East Aleppo, which was under rebel control. But ISIS were trying to break through and capture East Aleppo to try to expand their territory. So one day he's walking through his old neighborhood, his own neighborhood that he grew up with. He grew up in this neighborhood in eastern Aleppo. And all of a sudden there's one of these Toyota pickup trucks that comes around the corner. In the back there is a big C, there's one of these guns. And there are 3 guys in the front, all 3 of them masked, ski masks. They see him walking. There's nobody else in the streets, of course, totally deserted. Because the bombs are falling and there's fighting going on. They see him and they stop. And they arrest him. He says, "Look, guys, I'm Muslim. Why are you arresting me? I grew up in Aleppo. I'm also against Assad." And they said, we don't care. We are the Islamic State, and we are in charge now here. So he's like, what the hell is going on? He didn't expect it to get this bad. So they throw him in prison. So he's in ISIS prison now. He was then, so about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, he was in ISIS prison. And in prison, I asked him, what did you think about it? He said, I thought about how my life was a tragedy. One day, I'm in Assad's prisons. The next day, I'm in the ISIS prisons. What prison am I going to be in next? So he saw kind of the humor of it. And ultimately, he was released because he never recognized the ISIS people because they're always masked. They're masked because some of them are from the community. They don't want to be recognized. Because if they're recognized, then their families can suffer the consequences. He said, one of the guys recognized me, and he said, this is a good guy. You couldn't let him go. So there was a little bit back and forth. The commander who was in charge of the prison was from, he said he was from the Gulf, from one of the Gulf countries. He couldn't tell exactly where. And this guy negotiated with him, and he got me out of prison. Only later I found out who it was. So he got out of prison. Of course, as soon as he got out, he ran off to Turkey and never went back to Syria. That was 4 years ago, last time he went there. So what can you get from a story like this? Well, there's so many things his life story offers us. How do, for example, influential business families in Aleppo, how did they deal with the crisis? Because influential middle-class business families are very important. They are the stability, they're the pillars of Syrian society, especially in the big cities. Secondly, how did a 21-year-old man mobilize, went into the streets, and tried to bring about change in the society, growing up in an authoritarian society? How and why did he do that? And the third thing is, this is the only guy I interviewed who has been in both prisons, so he can do a comparison. And so I asked him about the conditions in the one prison and in the other, and he said they were very similar. They were using the same techniques, actually, in Assad's prison as they were using in the ISIS prison. So there's a kind of body of knowledge that circulates. My second and that will be my last example because we're running out of time, is this woman who I will name Anna. She is from the town of Salamiya, which is a town in the east of Syria. And the town is famous, and I also wrote Homs because she was born in Salamiya, but she was raised in the city of Homs. Salamiya is a town that has a overwhelming majority of the Ismaili community. The Ismaili community are an offshoot of Shia Islam. And this woman is a secular, well-educated woman, speaks fluent English, was educated at the University of Homs, studied law, became a lawyer, practiced law, and then the revolution began. She's from a family that are many of them were communists. An uncle was in prison many years under Hafiz Assad for allegations of communism. The father also in and out of prison, various conditions. And when the revolution began, or when the uprising began, Homs was particularly harsh struck, of course, in the fighting and the radicalization. She was interested in two things. One is because her family had a history with the regime, being in and out of prison. She wanted to defend the rights of the detainees. So somebody was arrested by the secret police. He would be arraigned in court. It's all pro forma, of course. Those are formalities. Going to go to prison anyway. But officially, they have a right to a lawyer. She would sign up as a pro bono lawyer to these guys. She would see them. Of course, they would be totally beaten up, totally emasculated. They don't get any food in prison. And she would try to defend their rights. Most of the time, she failed because, the judge overruled her and said they were traitors and they were sent back to prison, disappeared in the machinery of the regime. The second thing that she did was she volunteered for relief aid. So in Syria, it was illegal, and it is illegal under the regime area to provide support to those who are wounded. Medical aid is illegal. And doctors who provide medical aid are arrested, and many of them are killed. The number of doctors who were killed in Syria providing medical aid to besieged areas, for example, is incredible. They're in the thousands, including even medical students from universities. So she was very strong for that. One day, she told me, there are many anecdotes she told me, her life should be a biography, really. And I urged her also, please, you try to write your autobiography, but the trauma is quite high and she finds it difficult. One day she was traveling from her apartment in Homs to Selamiya, which is maybe like 2 hours, 2-hour drive, hour and a half. And there are many checkpoints. This is in 2013. Many checkpoints. Of course, there's this secret service, and there's that secret service, and there's this secret service, and this special force, and this secret police. There are at least 18 different checkpoints trying to get out of the city to her own town. Then she got to her own town, and she went around the neighborhood, and at one of the checkpoints, this was one of the worst checkpoints because these paramilitary groups, they were running this checkpoint, and they were terrorizing people there, trying to get bribes from people. You were terrified. You give anything they want, of course, because there's nothing to hold them accountable. And one man in particular, the man on the right, who shall remain unnamed for now, even though his name is well known even to the prosecutors in the Netherlands. He was a militiaman, pro-Assad militiaman, manned the checkpoint, very important in that area. He was like a regional boss. Everybody was afraid of him. We were pretty sure that he killed quite a number of people at that checkpoint. As you can see, he's quite comfortable with weapons, thuggish outlook. And he recognized her at the checkpoint. And he said, "Get out of the car." So she gets out of the car, a tiny girl, huge guy with a AK. And he said, "Are you the one who's helping out the opposition? This is your name, right?" And she said, "Yeah, that's my name." And he takes the small gun and he puts it on her head. And he said, "If I ever see you in the city again, I'll blow your brains out." And by that time, she was, of course, her knees are buckling. She gets back in the car, she drives to Homs, goes to Beirut, never comes back to Syria. Because they mean business, these guys. She got asylum ultimately in Holland. She came to the Netherlands, got asylum because she was working for a medical aid NGO. And one day, when she was going through social media, Facebook, Syrians, they have their own networks in Europe, all of a sudden, she recognizes the same guy who posts a selfie from the Netherlands. So she's thinking, what is going on here? Am I going to meet the guy at a supermarket? You know, what is he going to do? Is he just going to say hello to me and walk on? Right? So what happened, of course, is she walked to the prosecutor. She is a lawyer, so she compiled a dossier. She said, these are the screen grabs of a Facebook. Because the idiot also, he posts these selfies on his own Facebook. Huh? They're that intelligent, these people. He put it on his own Facebook, and she grabbed them all from his Facebook because he doesn't have any privacy settings on his Facebook. And then she compiled this dossier, sent it to the prosecutor in the Netherlands. And he's, of course, thank you very much. You know, he just gave me a dossier to prosecute a guy. His name, and he also used his real name entering the Netherlands. So they go to his house and they say, "Look, you have a subpoena. You have to, we'd like to talk to you." They go there with the police. They know he's dangerous. They take him to the police office. He sits there and he denies, "It's not me. Yeah, this was just," he says, "we were just playing around. Come on, like young men, we would like to have a gun and show how tough we are, etc. It wasn't me who killed all these people. No, that's someone else. You can't prove it anyway." So he challenged the prosecutor. The prosecutor says, "Okay, yeah, you can go back home." He went back home. The prosecutor then started, through Anna, contacted 3 or 4 important witnesses from that town. Tried to interview them. 2 of them wanted to be interviewed. Terrified, of course, of this guy. Terrified also with the family back home. Because the problem is not only you and me. The problem is that if she walks to the police, hands the guy into the Dutch police, his relatives and his buddies back home in Syria are going to go and arrest her brother. So now we have a Mexican standoff. I have your brother in custody in Syria, and you have my friend in custody in Holland. So this is a Mexican standoff, or a game of chicken. Ultimately, of course, what happened is that he ran off. One day, he just packed up his stuff, his passport, all of his money, and he ran off through, well, the Syrians, they come overland to Holland from the Middle East. He went back the other way. He went to Turkey, got in illegally into Turkey, got back illegally into Syria through the checkpoints by paying off the checkpoints, went back to Selamiya, and he's still there. So these are the kind of, and this is the story of only one woman. And these are, if we interview people, the more you interview, the more you will find stories like this. I was going to show actually one more example, but I won't. This is a terribly different story from a woman from suburb of Damascus. I'll skip that for a minute and I'll give you a couple of challenges and conclusions. Now, the conclusions are, I think we can get a lot of original insights from these interviews. The interviews, I think, are relevant scholarly, legally, and societally. And the scholarly relevance is also on multiple levels. The history of Syria, the psychology of victimization, even of perpetration, the sociology of polarization, collective biography of Syrians and young people in the Middle East. It gives us a lot of detailed material. And finally, we also have some challenges. There is significant fragmentation in the Syrian community. Are they going to be, would they want to be interviewed collectively in a project like this? And the final thing is of competing narratives. This, I think, is going to be a major challenge in this particular project and also for Syria in the future. Completely opposing views on the causes of the conflict, the course of the conflict, and the consequences of the conflict. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.